what would you take with you into a bar fight if you knew it was just going to be what you needed to survive to get in and out, right?
Right.
That's the attitude of a startup, right? Because there's a shot clock running, runway money maybe disappearing, or maybe there just is no money. Maybe it's not a VC model, it's just a self-funded bootstrap thing. And like, if what you make today is determines of whether or not you live tomorrow, that is the closest, like that's the real sense of urgency, right? That's, I think, where
why does that ever go away, though? I agree with you, but so you go into a situation like this recent engagement that I had, and who are you? Who's anyone? How arrogant do you have to be as anyone to think that you have the luxury to write a 15-page document and shove it down people's throats, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's that narcissism that comes around it. Like, that is not fundamentally, to me, sorry, I'm going to have a really strong opinion about this. That is not collaboration.
Yeah. No, and I agree from that perspective. I also think that if you go to any consulting of the big four, right, it's done that way. It benefits these organizations that are parasitical to the largest organizations, and some of them are bigger
for sure.
than, Cognizant's bigger than, they're bigger than some of their customers by a factor of 10 or 100, right?
Right.
But it benefits them to have a very murky, dense
You're so right.
layer of persistent problems that they never actually get to even looking at. And then they wrap a bunch of language around it, and that becomes the ontology that the C-suite uses and they use in terms of standing up SOW after SOW of promissory notes to fix the things. Because first thing you need to do is assess everything, which is true, but then you take that assessment and you break it into like, well, let's do SAFE, right?
Yeah.
Like the SAFE framework, which takes like 36 months to implement in a large organization if you're killing it.
Right.
So for an organization like, when people come from those organizations, they find it hard to break those patterns because those patterns are largely successful for creating air cover and letting you get things done because you're not. Yep.
Yeah. The contract that I have with the large government organization is that way. You're listening to the Proof Partners podcast. For more information, check out proofpartners.io. Everything gets put either in ServiceNow or some sort of Microsoft document on OneDrive, and that's it. And it's all CYA, right? Like you're not really collaborating with any of that stuff. The transport to smaller organizations and Google Drive and Google Docs is that I think that's maybe why I have such a visceral reaction to it. Is exactly that. I think we've kind of identified it, right?
Yeah.
Is because I have these experiences with startups. I have these experiences with really large kind of government organizations, which are the worst, right, in terms of getting stuff done.
Yeah.
And if you want to point to one single characteristic that's different, is that startups don't use documents or weaponize them to get zero things done.
Right. And if you look at the SaaS bloat that's occurred over the last 10 years with these organizations, right? 10 years ago, you know what we collaborated? HipChat and GitHub, period.
Yep. Yeah.
We were just writing issue blogs and communicating over Slack or some messaging protocol, period. Didn't have a document that I could see somebody where they are in the document and highlight. All that stuff is theater for the managers. It's not actually collaborative. Because, like I said earlier, if you don't want the baby to get murdered in the square in front of your family, then you have to protect it and cultivate and build the idea internally first in the safety of that privacy. Share it to people who maybe love you more than they love your ideas, and get it to the point where it actually can stand on its own a little bit, and then put it out there. At some point, it has to go out there. You have to get the market feedback, and there's people who argue about the timing on that. But I think that just to take an idea and just shit it out into the public square is also a selfish, shitty thing to do. Also, let me take up your time to read about this idea that I actually haven't thought about. I want you to actually fill in the blanks and create the idea, and that's a crappy way to treat people.
Well, you're forced either to do all the prep, right, to protect your fragile idea before you put it in the marketplace. And so that's a long document. and then present it to folks as a solid argument without collaborating with them because it's too fragile to collaborate. In which case, if you're at odds with management or the roadmap that's been established in some meeting that you weren't part of, your document's going nowhere anyway, and you've just wasted a ton of time.
Yeah.
Or you're forced to present your idea as an early thought where it's super fragile, in which case you're going to look like you are unprepared.
Yeah.
And so in this particular example, everything had to be in documents, and then those documents had, hundreds of comments sometimes. And more often than not, there was two things that I noticed that because of the culture it was never appropriate to bring up. And the two things that I noticed were, one, that most of the decisions were being made outside of the document anyway. And two, the people who really needed to understand those decisions and what was going on didn't use the document. They never actually read the document in the sense that it could be useful to them. And so the last piece of this, and then I'll stop talking. The last piece of it was that to be completely thorough in a document is very, very difficult. So if you want to, and this goes all the way, this isn't even this most recent engagement. This was a long time ago. If you want to write a document about how to do something, the instant you share it, it's stale. And so if you want to codify something, and you want it to last more than a minute, you have to have that document be essentially a set of principles or ideas, and really not very tactical in most cases. And so when you do that, now you have this layer of translation that has to happen for the folks who are going to be required to actually take action on it. So if your idea is, I want the UX to be, guiding principle, the user experience for our SaaS application needs to be easy to use, right? Like, we care about that. That doesn't mean anything to most people, right? Or it means something different to everyone. And anyway, it's not actionable. And so then you have to go down to the very practical level, and that document is going to get stale. So you've got all of these different things that are going on inside an organization, and the idea that you can corral them with ink and paper is a bit absurd.
But Amazon does it, right? So Amazon has the 6-pager, and they seem to have a lot of success in that. I don't know if the 6-pager is a success or the fact that they don't use PowerPoint is the success, because it seems as though maybe what they're trying to do is get everyone's attention to focus on one thing for a small period of time and get their feedback. To me, it doesn't seem like when you would read that, spend the first 30 minutes in silence in a meeting, which, seems to be like, I see a lot of videos of Jeff Bezos talking about it and others. Like, what is the value there? Is the goal to just have everyone sit in silence and be unobstructed from emails, messaging, whatever our discursive day looks like, to get 30 minutes of isolated focus from an executive team? And then does that 6-pager, this is what I don't know because I never worked at Amazon, but does that 6-pager actually get converted to some other document, or does it get downstream shared so that the others who are responsible to deliver on the promises made or the ideas and implementations in the document, do they get some copy of that? And so there's a lot of questions there, but mostly like Amazon does it. Why don't you see that working for smaller companies? And is there a philosophical difference between what they do at Amazon with a 6-pager and what you've seen in other experiences?
So my experience with the 6-pager is that everybody's gonna have a different, but this is just mine. Okay, so mine is that it forces the person who's going to have a position in a particular meeting to be thoughtful. That's the first part. Because you're not really allowed to use hypotheticals. You're not really allowed to use made up numbers, right? So no hypotheticals, made up numbers, no acronyms. Like you've got to spell it out, and that kind of discipline is super useful. And so, just as an aside, when I think about documents and how complicated that issue is inside organizations, what I mean by that is documents specifically for collaboration about new ideas. And I think what Amazon is doing with the 6-pagers, it's forcing folks who need to defend a position that we should do X or whatever it is with a level of detail that's going to be useful across an entire team and a level of discipline that it can be defended well. So you know that you have to create a thesis that is defensible in this organization. I think that's the primary use of the 6-pager. I've been in meetings at Amazon headquarters where the 6-pager was essentially ignored. So I think as in terms of like the overall usefulness of it, whatever. But the person who wrote it, they sure as hell know what they're talking about by the time they're done writing that 6-pager.
Yeah. I wonder about that too, because when you try to do that same sort of academic process for producing a document, it does slow down your thinking and force you to articulate details that may be self-evident to you that aren't to others, and it puts you in the position of the reader. And having that position, I think that is super helpful in document writing. But document writing at scale, where it's like, here's a document, put your comments in it, where you're not invited to add your section, or at least it doesn't feel like that. It sometimes can feel like, just sign off on this, just agree that you're going to do this, or ask some questions and make some comments. And I find that when the frequency of those documents starts to go over a certain point, I tune out. I'm like, I'm not reading this shit again,
Well, exactly. Or I'm not what's the purpose of it,
Well, that's the thing too, right? It's like, what happens after you create the document, right? Like, that's important. If the spirit of your writing is carried through the document and through multiple edits and revisions and feedback loops with others, if you feel as though the spirit of it is still there and it still has meaning for you, then maybe it's a healthy thing. But if it gets watered down to where you're missing the messaging, or someone who's going to be a consumer or reader of it becomes the primary objective of the editing process, then I don't know,
Well, so again, like back to the collaboration part and the Amazon piece. People connect, or I've heard people connect frequently, the 6-pager to the 15 minutes prior to a meeting where everyone reads the 6-pager. I don't think those things are connected. I think two different problems were being solved, and they happen to overlap. The first problem is that people were coming to meetings unprepared. Second problem is that people weren't reading when people did prepare. Right? And so you have these two different solutions that overlap. And I think, to bring it back to your point with, collaboration inside documents, it's a really dangerous, and actually this is really apropos because it's an emerging thing. Google Docs has allowed us to do this. You couldn't do this 5 years ago, 6 years ago.
Yeah. And Atlassian and others that use that symphony style of inputs, right?
Yeah. Early in my career, this wasn't a thing. You didn't pass around documents. If you were an attorney, maybe you'd mark something up, but you didn't pass around documents as a collaborative tool across distributed teams.
Oh, yeah. And I don't think even Word implemented the inline comment thing until Google Docs had done it as a competitive angle. Yeah.
Right. You had a meeting and someone took notes, or there was a scribe, or you all took notes, and then eventually it was congealed into a document that everybody agreed on.
So, just to interject, maybe it's not the document writing process or the editing process. Maybe it's the timing in which it goes to the larger audience, right? Like, you're familiar with the town square model. Will kill any idea that is creative. Frankly, it murders every baby before it's born. We'll have to edit that out. But there's a value to There's a value to allowing your ideas to curate the opinions that you expose your ideas to in the earliest phases, because they will get killed. I love that. I forget the guy's name, but he talks about the three phases that truth goes through. It's ridicule, violent opposition, and then accepted as self-evident. But if your idea is in the first two phases and it's fragile, then it will be murdered in the public square.
Yep.
So sometimes, and I've learned this in writing some of these documents for organizations, I've learned that this is a hard lesson for me to learn, to have several initiatives just face plant out of the gate and then have the company come back around to me. This is as my life as a consultant, right? I come in, I have a brilliant idea. I just plaster the place with the idea. I don't care. I'm just like, we're doing this. And then it inevitably gets shot in the face. And 6 months later, someone in the boardroom of my stakeholders goes, you know what? I was reading something the other day and I was thinking we should do this. And I'm like, that's what I said 6 months ago and you killed it. But the mistake I made in there was not curating the feedback to the people who were on the same page in a position of power that had identified the same problem. The solution is always going to look different, right? But identifying the common problem and then knowing the people in the room who have identified that also, or being very careful about who you air that document to. I know you've had this issue. I've seen you go through this. And your reaction is less hasty as mine, but where we're like, oh, it's obvious that it's this. Here's the thing you're not seeing. And crickets.
Right. I had a mentor early on and I had a big presentation or something going on, and we were having coffee, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, whenever you have a presentation, if people aren't on board with the problem, they'll never ever be on board with the solution.
Yeah.
And so he said, spend 90% of the time ensuring that everyone has a really clear idea of the problem and the sense of urgency necessary to solve it. And then the solution doesn't really matter because the solution will happen.
Yeah, that's like the Einstein, 95% of solving the problem is understanding it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
If you can guarantee a common understanding of the same problem, then the solution becomes self-evident, I think, in some regards.
Right. But to take it back to the document, I think documents are a really poor way to do that. They're a poor way to collaborate across that. Now, this goes back to...
So what's better? What's better than the documents? Because do you feel, as I do, that you're given maybe half a handful of vectors to communicate ideas to larger groups of people? So if the document isn't doing it, PowerPoint kind of does it at the highest level, the 10,000-foot view. What else could you do?
Let me back up and answer it in kind of an orthogonal way, which is, I think when you have a culture that struggles with an identity that's neither fully centralized command and control nor fully like autonomy, right? So individual responsibility and autonomy. When you have a culture that hasn't figured out which one of those it's going to be, I think the documents fill the gap very poorly. And so I realize that that's a sideways answer. So I think the if I were to make it a little bit of a
the problem isn't documents, obviously.
Exactly. Right. I don't think documents themselves are the problem. I think what you're trying to accomplish with them are the problem, and what you're trying to accomplish with them and why you're using documents to collaborate is ultimately going to be, evidence of a particular cultural thing.
Would you go as far as to say that if the trust was higher in environments, it wouldn't matter what document or what vehicle you were using to convey your ideas, you'd have a greater level of success with it?
Trust is certainly a big piece of it, but it's also, are you projecting, right? And so if you're a team lead and you write a document and the implicit understanding is that everyone is just going to do what you say, then, and I'm sure you've noticed this, then the collaboration in that document is forced to be either two things. One, nitpicky, where you're saying, oh, you need to add a period, or you didn't do camelback on this variable. Or two, broadly agree or disagree. You have to do one or the other. You can't come into that document and say, I have a fundamental disagreement with you about how we approach this particular thing, because it's not the place for that. When you're being told what to do by wire from centralized command and control.
And you probably are going to be triggered by the guy sending it, not the actual messaging.
Eventually you will, after 18
months.
That's
usually the case. I'm like, what the fuck does this guy want? It's garbage. It's total garbage. Actually,
yeah, you flip tables.
This is the document you sent me 6 months ago. Oh, sorry. Brilliant.
I take it back. It's brilliant.
I think that muddies the waters with everything, right? It's people over personalities, right? And or maybe I'm saying that wrong, but like the cultural components actually are such a defining influence. I'm thinking, as you were talking about how to get people to follow documents and be structured and get their ideas out there and communicate them effectively to galvanize a workforce in service of that effort. And I'm always thinking about when I worked at large financial organizations, it was just all that all day. You had to have process and this and that and whatever. And there's 40,000 people working in just that state for that organization, and it's just oppressive, right? And then you work for a startup where it's like, I think of me and Tom O'Reilly and Vinayak at Everscreen Media. We get into work and we'd be like, we have a problem, and they'd be like, what's the problem? I'd be like, this doesn't work with this, and now that's broken, and it's an impact to revenue, or blah blah blah. We'd be like, oh, let's get in a room and fix it. And we were probably 8 out of 10 times wrong with the fix, but that problem identification, solution validation wheel was just all we did. And when someone would come in and say, our services need to be more stable, we'd be like, fuck you. No, they don't. They need to have more we'll deal with that problem when it is a problem. Right now, what we need to do is provide something in the market that doesn't exist, and we need to do it yesterday because there's other people out there eating our lunch. That's a very different mindset than working in an enterprise. But it's probably another podcast or a series of podcasts around the differences between enterprise, SMB, and the small early stage startup groups. But I feel culturally, from my personality, the early stage stuff was the best, and only caught up similarly to doing consultative work across several large customers with a small group of consultants that I had a good communication and a good rapport with, which is Proof Partners now, but had been other places in the past.
Sure.
So it's safe to say that I am a negotiator and a collaborator, and I don't really care about the vehicle. I don't care about documents or videos, whatever. What I care about is that that people recognize my ideas as being the best. I'm just kidding.
Now we hear the truth.
It's sort of true. I wouldn't have said
it's sort of true.
Really true.
I think there's a bit of narcissism in every single document that's shared with more than one person.
Oh, and just don't take yourself so seriously, right? Like, you're so wonderful. I love playing to people.
I was going to say, I say all this as I'm about to share with you a 2-pager that I wrote last night just to try to get some ideas down.
I'm sorry, I'm not available.
Only write in the margins, please. But yeah, there's a place for it. There's certainly a place for it. I think I was gonna say something about all of that, because I think it's, for me, it just keeps going back to centralized command and control, and what are you actually going after with are you actually trying to collaborate? Oh, here's what I was going to say. And this is, again, it's a bit adjacent to the whole thing. When you're talking about Everscreen Media and what you were doing there, there's a point in the evolution of a company where it flips from being a kind of a protagonist or an antagonist or whatever in the business that they're in to being protectionistic. And it's really fascinating in my experience, if I were to, way oversimplify things, the use of documents as command and control mechanism is only acceptable in the latter, where organizations are in a protectionistic state of we've got to keep the cash cow we already have. And, so it's a lot of CYA, it's a lot of I told you so's, it's a lot of projecting ideas within a large organization. And my experience is the same as yours. In early stage startups or startups that are still hungry, even if they're successful, there's just no room for that kind of nonsense. And I think that's really telling, right? Like if it can't survive in a startup that has to survive, then how useful is it really?